Hey everybody, my name is David Katz-Nelson and I'm the CEO of Reboot. In March of this year, we were forced to move our Ideas Festival online and started to host conversations that were drawn out of the Reboot Ideas Festival program we had put together. And our hope with Reboot Ideas is to share the lens our artists use to refract their Jewish identities, to expose new ways of thinking for you all. So without further ado, let me introduce to you two people who will lead you through the next hour. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce you to these two incredible cultural creators, master the spoken word and the written word, and one, my friend. Adam Mansbach is the author of the worldwide bestseller, Go to Fuck to Sleep, the novels Rage is Back, Black White Boy, and The End of Jews, which won the California Book Award, and a dozen other books. He wrote the award-winning screenplay for the Netflix original film Barry, and his memoir, I Had a Brother Once, is forthcoming from One World Random House in January. Kevin Coval is the author of Everything Must Go, The Life and Death of an American Neighborhood, A People's History of Chicago, and 10 other collections and anthologies. He's the creative director and the founding editor of the BreakBeat Poets imprint on Haymarket, excuse me. These two collaborators and friends have dedicated years to analyzing the power of culture, to shape identity and the various levers of power that come with it. Today, we'll get a sneak peek into the candid conversations they are accustomed of having together. There will be time for questions during this hour. So if you have any for Kevin or Adam, please type them into the Q&A tab below, not on the chat, to make sure they get them. And so without further ado, Adam and Kevin, take it away.
David, thank you so much.
Yo.
Yes, sir.
You doing, Kev?
How are you, man?
I'm good. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to be seen, man. It's a pleasure. Thank you to Reboot for having us, and thank you, man, for I know you when they hollered at you, they were like, "Yo, who should I talk to?" You're like, "Probably should be Kevin. He's a Jew." So thank you for that. I appreciate being, your one Jewish friend.
Yo, you gotta have, I'm not even gonna make the one Jew joke. Let's leave that alone.
Okay.
But yeah, of course I thought of you, and to put you in context for folks who somehow have escaped your prodigious body of work to this point. It's funny because I've introduced you many times, and I feel like there are so many different ways to introduce you. Obviously, you're one of the most prolific and celebrated poets of our time. You stay producing work, but you're also an educator. You've really mentored several generations. If we use the hip hop definition of generation as the time it takes to be a teenager, without dating you, you've mentored 3-4 generations of Chicago artists, many of whom are now out in the world doing profound work of their own, all of it tinged with your stamp. When we look at a Chance the Rapper or a Vic Mensa or an Angel Nafis or countless other writers who are out here producing, we can see the stamp of the kind of rigorous training you have taken them through at YCA, Young Chicago Authors, and the way that you've encouraged them to think critically about the meaning and the use of poetry and of language in the world. So when I think about you, I think of you not only as somebody who is unafraid in your own work to take on themes of race and whiteness and identity and turn the lens on yourself and provide a kind of searing critique, both globally and nationally, of what these forces look like in play, but also to kind of, do that inner work and that reflection and put it all on the page. So, you and I have been talking about these things for 15 years now, since I came through Chicago on tour for Angry
Black White Boy. Yeah.
In 2005. And Trisha Rose, Professor Trisha Rose, who wrote Black Noise, who's now at Brown University, just started a podcast with Cornell West. She was like, you need to go fuck with Kevin Coval. So I was like, yo, Kevin Coval, I'm somewhere in Chicago. Come get me.
Let's link.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because I was thinking about when we met and we met on tour because Trisha had said that. And then I think Jeff Chang also put us together, the historian and culture worker. And I think that that when they said that, I was already down, because I was one, I think I'd already read your novel Angry Black White Boy, and I was already hip to your book of poems, the Genius B-Boys Getting Weeded in the Gardens of Delight, or so, it's a long title. I might be not getting all of it.
That's most of it.
And you know, recognized you first in text as a kind of brother, and then when we met, you know, kind of solidified, like there was definitely kind of familial connections. And I don't think it's like just as easy as like all Jews are related, because I don't necessarily even know if that might be true. But I think that, you know, because of the topics that you touched on in your work, your ability to not only level like a macroscopic critique, but connect it to the idiosyncratic and allow humor to play into, you know, these big weighty themes that you were taking on in your work, just really kind of like tickled and delighted me. And I'm like, yo, this dude is fresh and very knowledgeable and is approaching this in the kind of space that I think is like open for conversation, because you took it very seriously, but you didn't take yourself that seriously, even though you were serious about your craft. And I think that those are things that I find very admirable in artists. And one of the reasons why I think, you know, for me, your work is, and I know this whole forum is not just about us sweating one another, but, you know, before—
You don't like to do this for an hour?
I could. But, you know, before you had, you know, the you know, satirical kids book, you know, you were for me then, and you remain to be, I think, one of the most important novelists of the hip hop generation. And it's been profound to see then your storytelling capabilities to then extend itself into different genres like film and TV and the theater, for that matter. And so, yeah, man, it's a pleasure to be with you here, and always. And I am excited about this conversation, because it is a continuation of shit that we talk about on the regular, and that I think I actually, like, you know, I do think is instructive to kind of allow people to also be in the conversation with us, because I know people are already having these kinds of conversations, maybe in smaller groups, and sometimes at a you know, maybe sometimes at a community level too. But I think the conversation that you and I have amongst one another is you know, kind of, it needs to be taken out into the public, because we need to wrestle like this in our minions and in our community spaces, in our ciphers, in our congregations, and you know, community centers and beyond. And so I'm excited to do that with you today.
Indeed. So where do we begin?
Yeah, well, look, I know that part of what we want to talk about is kind of, you know, Black and Jewish relations in our lifetime, because I think one of the things that as a people we rely on a nostalgia for, you know, we've kind of revisioned the past and want to rely on our collective history in you know, being champions or being allies, or, you know, being in the mix during the civil rights movement. But I think that, you know, our generation and then younger generations have, you know, that's not necessarily relevant to them. And I think we want to talk a little about you know, Black Jewish relations in our lifetime. And maybe a good jumping off point, and maybe you could take folks through, is some of the recent critique, or the leveling of the anti-Semitic term charge against one of our favorite poets and lyricists, the rapper Ice Cube.
Yeah, that's a good way to start. We could also begin with Nick Cannon and his recent interview with former Public Enemy member Professor Griff, which in turn, you know, and it's funny because both of those moments, right, that happened in the last couple of weeks, they link us directly to 1989, 1990, right, when Public Enemy was collapsing under the weight of the controversy around Welcome to the Terror Dome and Professor Griff's anti-Semitic comments to a British journalist, which, you know, because of the time lag, took 6 months to be reported in this country by, I think, the Washington Times. And Ice Cube going solo in 1990, linking up with Public Enemy and the Bomb Squad, cutting off his Jerry curl and beginning to read The Final Call and quote Farrakhan, and possibly even going as far as joining the Nation of Islam. He flirted with it. I don't know if he was a full-fledged member.
Yeah, I think he said he never kind of was affiliated, because that was the common critique in that battle, in that diss track toward that Common put out against
Yeah.
Cube, and then Cube was like, well, no, I was never really affiliated. That's why I still can do St. Ides commercials.
Right. I feel like, we're also getting very deep in some weeds that we know very well and are almost speaking in shorthand. So let's unpack that before everybody is like, I got to get the fuck out of here. In recent weeks, Ice Cube posted what was largely perceived as, a classically anti-Semitic conspiratorial Jews control the world meme on Twitter, right? Which folks were largely incredibly disappointed and disenchanted by. Probably nobody more so than, his various managers and representatives who probably watched the phone stop ringing for the first time in Ice Cube's long career. A career which has taken Ice Cube from being like the symbolic angriest black man in America, the writer of songs like Fuck the Police, to a family-friendly, cuddly guy who makes movies like Are We There Yet?, which are, arguably fun, but definitely for the whole family. So to see him kind of go back into that direction, I think confused a lot of people who possibly don't have the historical purview to like really remember not only where Ice Cube came from, but also how important a figure Ice Cube was, right? Like,
yeah, this guy sells us beer. He's not there to remind us that the overall construct of the country is white supremacy.
Right. Ice Cube was one of several hip hop lyricists who predicted the Rodney King riots and the way that Los Angeles went up in flames in '92 in the aftermath of the not guilty verdict for the cops who beat Rodney within inches of his life, caught on videotape. Nothing new about that except for the advent of cheap camcorders, right? This was a pivotal moment, again, in our lifetime in race relations in this country. And Ice Cube was talking about precisely those tensions, those situations, the cops, black-white stuff, tensions between black and Korean store owners in Los Angeles. Like, he really had sort of articulated what that entire powder keg looked like. And when it exploded, suddenly this guy was on Nightline explaining it, to Ted Koppel and things like that, which was an incredibly powerful moment for hip hop because rappers were not often accorded that level of visibility in mainstream media. And this is something we as hip hop generation folks, rap fans and aficionados had been calling for. We'd been looking for that level of visibility from hip hop leadership, from the Chuck D's, from the Ice Cubes, from the KRS-Ones. And suddenly in '92, Ice Cube had that platform. But
at that same time, I just want to remind us that at that same time, when he got that platform, achieved that status, kind of crossed over into a sort of mainstream political discourse. It's also when he started to get charges of anti-Semitism thrown at him, in part because of a song he had, that was a diss record towards his former crew NWA, called No Vaseline, in which he talks about his relationship, or NWA's relationship to their manager, Jerry Heller, who's Jewish, and he had some choice words for that relationship. And part of the reason why Cube left NWA was because of a disagreement around the business practices of that group.
Yeah, that's right. And this Ice Cube moment was also on the heels of the breakup of Public Enemy, called at various points the most important and most dangerous group in music, who, after putting out Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back in '88, Fear of a Black Planet came out in '89, the group breaks up because it cannot sort of situate itself around Professor Griff's comments. Professor Griff is a marginal member of the group who is feeling left out because he doesn't have a well-defined role. He's not one of the primary songwriters, nor is he one of the primary producers. He's almost a glorified road manager whose job is the unenviable task of trying to wrangle Flavor Flav, who, is not an easy guy to wrangle. Griff is a very disciplined guy. He's a martial artist, but he's also pissed off and also is reading The International Jew and taking it to be gospel. And it's funny because part of the reason, and this goes back to the complexity and the intertwined nature of Black-Jewish relations, in the country, in the music industry, in cities, at this moment that we're talking about, Public Enemy was caught flat-footed in responding when Professor Griff told a journalist that Jews are responsible for the majority of wickedness on the planet Earth, a quote that I can still speak word for word 30 years later or more, because it was so disturbing and so important when it happened to me, not as a Jew, but as a Public Enemy fan.
Right.
Right. But one of the reasons Public Enemy is caught so flat-footed in responding is because it was so unthinkable to them that they could be accused of being anti-Semitic when in fact they were surrounded by Jews and considered themselves almost, like, Jewophiles, right? They're produced, Bill Adler is their management. They're surrounded by folks like Rick Rubin and Leor Cohen and
they're from Long Island. I mean, let's remember too, right? Like they really are some, submersed in some ways in a kind of Jewish culture. And so, yeah, I mean, so that's fast forward, right? I mean, this comes full circle in 2020 because Nick Cannon has Professor Griff on his podcast. And one of the things that Nick Cannon says is that, Black folks are the original Hebrews. And then, Cube goes on a kind of Twitter tirade, in, just a few weeks before that, where he's utilizing kind of archaic symbolism that connects, like is from conspiratorial ideas that Jews run the world and banks and are part of these cabals, and also ends up using some imagery from a mural that was done in London, which is, clearly kind of anti-Semitic, like a bunch of, big-nosed folks at a Monopoly table, where the puzzle pieces themselves are kind of like Afrocentric or Black-centered iconographies on the Monopoly table. And so all of this, right, we've, like the Twitterverse kind of explodes, but it's terrain you and I have kind of, been through before, both as very young people, but then also, being involved in, cultures that have discentered our Jewishness and kind of centered our whiteness in some ways. And so my question is, like, what do you make of the recent flare up around Ice Cube, around Nick Cannon, as a vehicle for us to maybe talk about and I think you might think this too, a misperceived Black anti-Semitism?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I think two things come to mind. One is just revisiting the meaning, the significance, the importance of the Nation of Islam, the Nation of Gods and Earths, in hip hop culture, and thus to the cultural context in which a generation of folks who are now making culture on a massive level, the matrix in which we grew up, right, is one in which, those organizations were central philosophically to the world of hip hop. And it wasn't because they were anti-white, although there was certainly some of that rhetoric in the mix. There was the Yaqub creation myth, there was the notion of the white devil. But what it meant, it was one of the things that made whiteness, I'm very grateful for it, let me say that, because it was one of the things that made whiteness visible and decentralized it from its presumed position of centrality, its invisibility. Hip hop made whiteness subjective for me and for you and for a generation of young white and Jewish listeners in the late 80s and in the early 90s, when Brand Nubian was rhyming about drop the bomb and make the devil pay the piper. My impulse was not to be angry at them, but to figure out some rhetorical framework and loophole via which I could acknowledge the historical wrongs perpetuated on the non-white world in the name of whiteness and Christianity, while also carving out some exception for myself, some way in which I could live. But my goal at no point in that process, and as a hip hop kid at that point, it was incumbent on you to research and learn all of the history, everything you were being presented. If Chuck D name dropped Joanne Chesimard, I wasn't going to do shit until I figured out who Joanne Chesimard was. Everything else had to go on pause.
Let me pause you for one second, because I think you said something that's really important that I think we could actually learn a lot from now. You said something basically about once you heard or perceived the anger in the lyric, you didn't necessarily take offense to it, right? In part because you didn't necessarily see it as a direct a target of your own person. You saw it as a critique of a larger system or a larger way of being that the world had placed upon, you know, Black folks in this country, and you wanted to kind of decipher and deconstruct the reason why it existed in the first place. And I think that's instructive, because when we think about, you know, whiteness as opposed to white people, I think that that's an effective tool of engagement to kind of, you know, see critiques, even if we perceive anti-Semitism, you know, and I want to get into this, it's not necessarily like that folks are anti-Semitic. It's in part because there is a larger issue and kind of, you know, I will talk about this James Baldwin essay in a minute, but I think that that's a really like salient, important point to highlight, that as white folks, to be able to hear critiques of whiteness, or, you know, white people, or Karens or Kevins or whatever the fuck, you know, we label on them, is that it like get to the root of the anger as opposed to necessarily be in our feelings. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, one thing that you learned early was that if folks were talking shit about the white man in your presence, that was a compliment. The fact that you were able to be in the room for those discussions allowed you to understand the differences between anger writ large, semantic anger, generalized anger, well-informed, historically informed anger, and anything directed at you personally. You know, and as a white kid in hip hop, you were constantly looking for the fissures between the political and the personal. You were trying to understand how dudes who were members of the Nation of Islam also let you sleep on their couch for 3 weeks straight while talking about the white devil, you know, and you quickly learned, you know, certain, like Upski in his book, Bomb the Suburbs, an early and crucial testament by a white Jewish hip hop kid. You know, he said, look, not all snakes are poisonous, but you'd be a fool to go around picking up snakes and hugging them to see which ones were. And that was the attitude that a lot of folks, a lot of Black folks we grew up around in the world of hip hop thought about whiteness. And, you know, you mentioned the Baldwin essay, which I think we should get into, in terms of the conflation or not conflation of Jews and whiteness within the Black community and the things that we kind of experience in that era. So maybe you want to speak on that for a second. Then we talk about some points, some critical points in our lifetimes where Jews take a turn toward whiteness and what that ramifies like.
Yeah. So I just dropped the essay in the chat, and it's, you know, it's a Baldwin essay. You know, basically Black folks are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white, and I've found it to be very instructive in, you know, deciphering, deconstructing, and just, you know, trying to assess this charge, you know, that sometimes that charge of anti-Semitism shuts down a conversation, shuts down people. It's leveled against people in order to not necessarily take the critique serious. And I think that there's a problem in that, you know, to your point, that I think sometimes, you know, folks will speak from whatever vantage point, and things will get conflated, and we won't necessarily dig into the impetus for the critique. And in the Baldwin essay, basically it's like, you know, it kind of says it in the title, but it's a really beautiful and a relatively short read that if people have not already done so, and I'm sure a lot of folks here have, but I would really encourage us reading and revisiting. I come to it, you know, every so often, because it does this work of, you know, kind of align, I think, in a different way, you know, calling Jews to ally with, you know, and obviously this is for white Jews, you know, and you know, there are a ton of, you know, Black Jews, which I think is the point, Nick Cannon was making, which is why I got in trouble with my rabbi as a kid, because I took what KRS-One said in the 89-90 song, Why Is That? And brought that to him and told him that Moses and Abraham are Black, and got kicked out the synagogue, because as white Jews in this country, and just as white people in this country, we have a difficulty understanding a more in a different history than the one that we've been, you know, miseducated into believing. But the Baldwin essay makes a few points that I think are relevant, and I want to quote from Baldwin. One does not wish, in short, to be told by an American Jew that his suffering is as great as the you know, American Black suffering. It isn't, and one knows that it isn't by the very tone in which he assures you that it is. right? And I think when we talk about the Jewish experience in America as opposed to Black folks' experience in America, we're talking about radically different realities. And I would argue that Jews in this country have had the ability, those who are white or white passing have the ability to become white and to assimilate into all of what whiteness allows one in terms of privilege. And I think then, that has created a kind of rupture for us in terms of our own identity, certainly in terms of our politic. And it's caused a kind of amnesia because we then participate in a kind of white revising of our own story, of the history of some of the places that we come from. And I think that is problematic really only to us. And it also creates these, gigantic fissures between us and communities that I think, fairly naturally we could be and have been maybe in the past in solidarity with. And so, yeah, I mean, I have one other piece from the Baldwin text, but I know that this is something that you also read and wrestle with, this Baldwin essay.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, I think that point you just made about how in the pursuit of whiteness, the Jews have changed bedfellows in very deliberate and problematic ways is something I think about a lot. And, it's funny, I'm asked, like, even in the run up to this conversation, I've been asked, like, well, when did the Jews begin to become white? When did the Jews become white? And there are so many answers to those questions, right? There are so many milestones, there are so many things to look at, and you could look at public policy, you could look at housing segregation, you could look at all of these things, but there are also these cultural moments. And the one that I think about a lot is the way that the historic and rightly celebrated Black Jewish Civil Rights Alliance began to collapse, or maybe finished collapsing in the 80s. And in my mind, the specter of Black anti-Semitism was used as an excuse for Jewish pullback from an alliance that was not conducive to finishing the job of becoming white. So various Black leaders were positioned as and accused of anti-Semitism, simultaneously put on a pedestal as if they and their views represented in totality those of the Black community. And then they were kind of symbolically and ritually banished for life. And in the aftermath of that, there was cover, emotional, political, spiritual, economic cover for this immense pullback from this Civil Rights Alliance. Maybe the best example, the simplest example, is Jesse Jackson, who is running a very viable campaign for the Democratic nomination in 1984 until, on the eve of the New York primary, he says Hymietown. Hymietown. That one word banished him, branded him as an anti-Semite, effectively erased his entire life up to that point, right? He says that, and he is come down upon with such vehemence, a vehemence that other non-Black public figures who utter anti-Semitic remarks are not treated with, right? Mel Gibson goes on a fucking epic drunken rant, says that all the history, all the wars in the history of the world are the fault of Jews, and it takes about 4 seconds for the ADL to reach out to him and be like, whenever you sober up, we're ready to have a conversation. Come eat some bagels with us and let's talk this over. We know that your father is a fucking Holocaust denier. You've got a long history of being a scumbag on many levels, but come kick it with us. Let's build. Jesse Jackson has never been issued any invitation remotely like that. His offense is this anodyne word, Hymietown, which frankly is irrelevant then, is even more relevant now. Sounds like some shit from the New York Board of Tourism. Like, hey, come visit Hymietown, bring your family. Like, we got the best bagels, catch a show at the Yiddish Theater.
Yeah, I thought that was like a section of Coney Island, but
I'm saying, yeah, but it's seized upon and grabbed as if everybody is waiting for a way and a reason to discredit Jackson and push him off a certain kind of cliff.
Well, Adam Mansbach, let me ask you a question, man, because you are currently, you're working on a sort of memoir in verse, and I know that you touch on on this, this connection to Jackson in this moment, in your life. Do you want to, I don't know if you just kind of created a summary of that text, but do you want to read some of that? Is that an opportunity to do so?
I got it up here. I think I might have just said, like my freshest lines.
Okay,
but,
all right, word.
Yeah. I mean, the gist of it is that this word Hymietown is imbued with blood venom. It erases the history of the man who said it until he is nothing else, until he has never stood on a balcony in his life. And at the same time, he is made to stand for all of Black America when he says Hymietown, right? And it becomes this reason, he's unlidded the simmering cauldron of our former bedfellow's secret treachery and must be banished to a realm of infamy from whence there can be no escape, from whence 36 years later, your right of return is still denied. Do not confuse it with the timeout corner to which you will be lovingly escorted for declaring that Jews are responsible for all the wars in the history of the world. If you are noted white historian Mel Gibson, to sober up for 18 minutes before the Anti-Defamation League invites you over to nosh on some latkes and have a nice productive chat. So there's that moment. And similar moments happen with Farrakhan around the quote that Judaism is a gutter religion, which is taken out of context. There are problematic things about Farrakhan, but he is painted with a brush, and that brush is made out of a misquote from a larger speech in which he is saying that every religion has the capacity to do good or evil, can be a gutter religion or a religion that uplifts folks. But there's this appetite to seize on these folks and discredit them and thus pull back from this alliance. And, that is the path toward whiteness. That is the path that leads us to a place where, to bring this into the present, the two most powerful Jews in America right now are Stephen Miller and Jared Kushner, right? So Jewishness becomes conflated with whiteness. What does whiteness in America look like? It looks like hierarchy, it looks like supremacy, and it looks like imperialism. And that in turn brings us, to Israel and Palestine, which is ultimately unavoidable in this conversation as well. Yeah. And I know you have thoughts about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to say a few things. One, that I'm excited for that book, that you're writing, that you're working on. And I think, you're like our stories are, and you deal with this a lot in your work, is very much trying to take what we, I think, often don't talk about and unfurl it, to kind of like unwrap it in a way that I think is very exciting and provocative. And so I'm excited for your continued kind of examinations and re-examinations of your identities woven within your own narrative. So, for me, I it's, you ask like, well, when did we become white in this country? I wrote a book a few years back called Shtick, which is kind of an examination of how we did just that. And, obviously there isn't necessarily one place to pinpoint it, like, but there, for me, I do attempt to do that in the book. And there's this moment in 1908 where Abraham Raymer is, lynches and stabs, one of the folks who's working, in or around his house, a Black man named William Donegan at the time. And he goes free. Abraham Raymer goes free for killing this Black man. And I think, to me, when we examine, racial relationships in this country, I think, the minute Jews got off the boat, of course, they experienced what every ethnic group that is not Black folks in this country experience, which is kind of a stepping past. They get a run up towards that ladder of assimilation in this country, because the whole country is rooted in the exploitation and dehumanization of Black people and Black labor. And so I think that it's nothing new for Jews in some ways to then, in this country since that time, then lean toward assimilation, to lean toward whiteness, in part because it's a way to, one, experience more privilege, a different kind of life. In some ways, it's a way to also hide and to save ourselves. And so I want to acknowledge that I also understand that impetus in some ways, because for the first time, maybe in the history of our people, in the history of our lives, we've been able to pass. We've been able to get by in some ways. We've been able to be safe. And so I think that that is significant. For me, I think that it's developed a grotesque kind of alliance then with a kind of whiteness, a kind of evangelical Christianity that I find baffling in some ways, because these are the same people who ultimately want to see our demise. The logical conclusion, or the not logical, the irrational conclusion of so much of what I fear in evangelical Christianity, the kind that seeps into American electoral politics, the kind of whispering that Falwell and Pat Robertson were doing in the era of Reagan, and the kind of white nationalism mixed with the kind of evangelical Christianity that is celebrated by the president and those around him, like the Vice President Pence, is that Jews ultimately need to be in Israel in order for destruction, in order for the Messiah to come back, and that isn't hyperbole. I mean, that really speaks to, I think, some of what eschatologists, apocalypticists believe, that in order for, which is part of the alliance, I think is part of the reason why you see so heavy evangelical Christians riding for the state of Israel, for the Zionist and problematic folks who lead that country, is because they want us there when there will be no more, so Jesus can come back and everybody could turn up, or whatever happens. I didn't get that far in the book, but
that's the game plan, no question.
That's the game plan, right? 144,000. Those do not include us, And so for me, I think that what has happened is that we ourselves have been lulled into a kind of white coma, to believe that folks that we find ourselves making bedfellows with politically, when we move into areas that are predominantly white, and maybe they let us into the country club, oh my God, for a moment, I think we are lulling ourselves into a sense of staidness, but ultimately it's at our own demise. And what it absolutely does is create a fissure, a rupture with folks that we should be in working class solidarity with, and that we should be in solidarity with, because we ultimately are people who I still want to imagine believe in justice. And the way that it affects our politic when it comes to Israel is that we have essentially, our whiteness has made us kind of mad. Whiteness is a kind of amnesia. Whiteness is a psychosis, as Baldwin would say. It's a disease. And so it has made us it's created a blindness when it comes to the state of Israel, and similar practices that are created in this country, second-class citizenships, dual citizenships, the way that we treat Black folks in this country is analogous to the way that Palestinians are treated in Israel and beyond. That Jews, the way we've made a myth in Israel, the same way America has made a myth about indigenous folks in this country. And so until we rectify those historic ills, until we rectify our own views and our own ideas about how that state is, and until we rectify the way we engage with other kinds of people in this country, we will never see the cessation of those old kind of anti-Semitic slanders that come from communities that we are hurt by because we imagine ourselves, for right or for wrong, to be in solidarity with. And so I think that, to me, is like that is, therein lies the issue.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I would also say, as you might expect. And in addition, I would say also, I mean, there's an appetite on the part of many to have these conversations about Judaism and justice without addressing, like, we're Americans. Why can't we have these conversations without bringing the Middle East into it, without bringing Israel into it? And, the answer, I think, is that if you are silent on it, you are complicit, right? If you want to educate folks about the fact that Judaism does not equate with Zionism, you must articulate that fact. If you want to express a different relationship and a different reality, the mic is open. Very few people actually take the opportunity to do so.
Which is why it was actually very refreshing to see your man Seth Rogen the other day on the Mark Maron show talk about kind of the ridiculousness about in regards to the education around the state of Israel, and also how like Israel is there is a generational disconnect. And I think part of it is because of the way that current formal Jewish education works, right? That I think that there's a ton of really unfortunate and bad pedagogy. But also when it comes to Israel, I think young people are, they're hip, you know what I mean? They're hipper than maybe their parents who got sold a, first or second generation dream. And I also think that there's so much information now because, Palestinians and those in solidarity with them have done a very strong job of ensuring that some of those stories are told, not in the dominant media by any means, but because they have access to the internet, because Gen Z has a fluidity that exists beyond borders that I think Jewish people in diasporism need to believe in more thoroughly, that the idea, the notion of a Zionist state is problematic at best, and is maybe more insidious than that once you dig into it. And so, I think we're seeing some of that turn in kind of the offhanded nature that Seth Rogen, said on a very popular podcast.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's worth noting also that Seth Rogen as a comedian is tapping into a long history of radical, progressive, justice-oriented Judaism that finds expression through the words and through the acts of comedians and folks it's not a coincidence that Jews have had an outsized influence on comedy in this country alongside Black folks. And if you look at some of the history of Jewish humor, it's shot through with a self-awareness, a self-critique, and an ability also to turn anti-Semitism against the anti-Semite. But all of it speaks to the importance of the margins, the importance in Jewish communities of the fact that, Judaism is like the Hotel California of religions. You can check out, but you cannot leave because, you don't find Episcopalians saying like, oh, I'm Episcopalian, but I'm Buddhist, right? That's not an option for them.
I'm culturally Episcopalian.
Yeah. So, I think that the fact that there are so many different ways to feel marginal, alienated, ambiguous about Judaism while never abandoning that identity, it leads to the kind of discomfort that leads to analysis and leads to art. And I think a lot of the folks who've done this incisive work through comedy and through art are coming to it from that place. The writers, for example, that we venerate in the Jewish 20th century American tradition are not particularly religious folks, whether it's Malamud or Roth or Lenny Bruce, these are not folks who are going to synagogue every week. They're folks who grew up in the tradition, but now cast a very critical eye on it. And a lot of the humor speaks to that, and also speaks to the fallacy of thinking that at any point, the whiteness that you're trying to embrace is embracing you back. I'll give you two quick examples, right? There's a joke that I love that is very, some people hate, but I think it's brilliant. I think it's a perfect example of Jewish humor. This Jewish guy moves in next door to Rockefeller. He's got the same car as Rockefeller, even hires the same guy to trim the hedges. One day he's walking to his car and Rockefeller walks out of his house and looks over, sees his neighbor and is like, hey, you think you're as good as me, don't you? The Jewish guy looks at Rockefeller, he's like, as good as you? I think I'm better than you. Rockefeller is furious, demands to know why. Jewish guy is like, well, for one thing, I don't live next door to a Jew.
Well done.
Thank you.
Well done. Yeah.
I think there's so much embedded in that about the nature of anti-Semitism and the nature of buying into these narratives around arrival and safety and whiteness and finding safety in this provisional whiteness that will really only ever be provisional. And I think that's worth remembering, and it's worth embracing, and it's worth using as a reason to step away from that whiteness, to step away from the nimbus of privilege and the baggage inherent to that privilege and the complicity in everything from American imperialism to the dissolution of the bonds that you referred to earlier around working with folks for justice for all. These things are incompatible with each other. You've got to pick one.
Yeah. No, man,
Um,
big facts. I know we got some questions that,
yeah,
that folks have been really patient about asking. I want to address them. And I think
yeah,
you're right, man. To step away from complicity is very important. I think just in terms of art, I think about, your man, Abel Mirapool, who wrote
yeah,
Strange Fruit, you know what I mean?
yeah.
And like, just, understanding that kind of intentional solidarity
Abe
to move.
Miracle not only wrote Strange Fruit, he also wrote the Gargoyles column in the City College newspaper in the early 20s that my grandfather grew up reading and eventually took over when he was at City College.
Let's
So,
go.
you
Let's
know what I
go.
mean? What?
All right, man. So, all right. So I'm going to read, David Mayer has a question. Can our guests give us a take on a journey of how we as Jews might get to a place of reparation, which may lead us to reconcile and renewal? Yeah.
I like
Okay.
the alliteration in there. I'm not sure
It's a lot of bars.
what reparation in what way and for who, I guess is my question. I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, well, I'll say this. I mean, I think what is interesting, right, is that Jews have had the ability, privilege, and foresight to create institutions that have preserved Jewish language, religion, culture, education, and I think when I imagine the space or a space in which reparations are if we as a country, as we should, move towards reparation to, and I believe in reparations because I believe in restorative justice, right? I think that if you believe that no one is we can't really disqualify no one, we can't throw away anyone. I think that means ourselves as white people in this country. And I think that part of the process of reparations is to go back and restore justice because of grand injustices that have occurred chronically in the maintenance of this country and in the maintenance of whiteness. And so for me, a kind of reparations is to ultimately fund and build and sustain for generations Black institutions that are concerned with education and the maintenance of culture and all of those things that come with it. And I think in some ways there is a real sight to learn from Jewish institutions, perhaps, who have done the same thing.
Yeah. Should we look through these questions?
Yeah, you just want me to. I mean, some of them we've already touched on. Do you want me to just rattle them off?
Yeah, I'm looking for some things here that we can.
Maybe,
Okay.
Okay.
Here's
Yeah, go
one.
ahead.
Well, I'm gonna just read let's see. Need to re-educate our Jewish community. The question is essentially about whether we are talking about whether it is important and when it is important to call out anti-Semitism. I think that to read a little bit into the question, I think we've been talking a lot about what anti-Semitism is connected to, the conflation of whiteness and Judaism and all of that. But I think it's a good question. Like, okay, everything you said and all the historical context you're given, cool. But also when motherfuckers say some shit that's clearly anti-Semitic, when and how do we respond? Which I think is, yeah.
No, I think that's a good point. And, for me, I think part of what it marks is, we still, as a country, certainly as a country, we still are submerged in a kind of Christian-centered education. And so part of what happens is that some of what we glean from the New Testament are teachings that, of course, filter into our public education system. And so I think some of them that anti-Semitism comes from a misreading, I would say, ultimately, of the New Testament, and a misreading of certain, Christian principles that have been, I think, bastardized to be to create boundaries between people. And so I think that's part of what's at play, is that Black folks have been miseducated, like everyone has been miseducated, right? And so we ourselves as Jews, I think, sometimes carry certain ideas that we have been carried over from Christian teachings that at a root point towards anti-Semitism. And so when I hear some things, sometimes it is merely a regurgitation of that kind of miseducation. I also think some of what is at play is this contestation of what is the history of Jews, and like don't we need to reconcile and retell and revise a story that is more in line with what Nick Cannon was saying, certainly with what KRS-One had taught us and generations, is that, Jews are and have been Black, and why don't we tell that story in our synagogues, particularly in this country, particularly in those white-centered synagogues? And I think therein lies some of the problem and some of the answer as well.
Yeah, I think those are good points. I mean, I think also the anti-Semitism that I am least concerned with is anti-Semitism coming from Black folks and communities of color, right? I'm much more afraid and incensed by and scared of anti-Semitism coming from the mouths of those who are explicitly in favor of a white nationalist agenda. I think there's a difference between deliberately incendiary, hateful remarks and remarks that, as often as not, are lacking in the desire, spirit, or ability to affect any harm on Jewish communities. And it's funny to me that those kind of remarks from folks like a Nick Cannon, from folks like a Jesse Jackson, are taken so much more seriously than policies explicitly designed around harm to Jewish communities, to communities of color, to immigrant communities.
Because you know what happens, man, is that we show our paternalism. We really show our whiteness when we accuse folks of anti-Semitism. That's when we bring them in the rabbi's room to scold them. You know what I mean? And I think that is grotesque. And I think we would be better served if we kind of saw that as an opportunity to build a bridge and to seek solidarity, rather than scold people for having these beliefs that are archaic and maybe the etymology of which folks weren't 1,000 on. But it's really an opportunity to kind of ally ourselves, I think, and build solidarities in response to like a white supremacy that also doesn't include us.
Yeah, that's well put, man.
Yeah, man, it's 11:55. I know. We got a few minutes before David hops back in. Yeah. What else? Anything else? Should we talk about? I don't know. But y'all are asking great questions, and the chat is getting very spicy. So appreciate that. Appreciate y'all tuning in.
I haven't looked at the chat. I've only looked at the Q&A.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of. I mean, no surprise. Jews have had a lot to say. They've written a lot here. There's been a lot of text. All right, man. What do you think? We as Jews, what can we do to become stronger allies with such movements as BLM? Since we are also such a diverse community fighting for a more accepting, progressive, inclusive society, what makes smart coalition building in the pursuit of a more progressive and inclusive society? That's a good question to go out on. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I got caught up reading through the chat while I was, I can't do two things at once. Go ahead, and I have a thought, but go ahead and jump in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to acknowledge our, I think we have to acknowledge our whiteness, obviously, and kind of lead with that. That I think, and this is coming from the Baldwin essay, is that, I think folks, for the most part, we aren't in this country, in this moment, in this time. Jews aren't walking into public space and being called Jews necessarily, by and large, right? The first clear identifier is that we are white people. And so I think if we begin to kind of build solidarity, it has to come from an unpacking, a wrestling, an understanding, a deconstructing with our whiteness. And then I think we could build bridges, because that's all just like very good, intercultural solidarity building, bridge building work is like, what do you eat? My people eat this. Where do you come from? You know what I mean? It's just like, that's good solidarity work that we've seen before. There's a reason why, a large percentage of white freedom riders were Jews. There's precedent for this. I think we have to, though, understand the last, 100+ years in this country. We've been able to shed our main identity as Jews and adapt and blend and meld into the identity of white people in this country and what that means then to communities of color, particularly Black folks.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. You know, in terms of the question of how are we better allies, all of that, you know, I think that we have a tendency often to stall ourselves out by intellectualizing these things, by not acting until we have determined the perfect course of action. And I think that in many cases, and this applies unilaterally, not just to Jewish folks, but to everybody, get off your ass and make a move. Get involved at the level where you feel comfortable, where you see a point of entry. If you don't see a point of entry, dive into the fucking pool and figure it out as you come up for air. It's a lot easier to figure these things out while you're moving than it is to sit and contemplate them until you know that you're ready, because you may never get to that point. And I think something that I've seen for years as we do work around anti-racism and galvanizing white people to engage in this fight, in this process, is a certain kind of paralysis that sets in. This fear of doing something wrong and being called out and embarrassing yourself, that in turn engenders this paralysis and doesn't actually help anybody. You know, and it will not kill you to get something slightly wrong. And folks will probably be far more charitable with you than you deserve, you know? And also, your point of entry can be something that you're already knowledgeable and passionate about, right? Like, the nature of white supremacy and racism in this country are that they are so insidious that they infect every facet of American life. So if you happen to know about education, there's a way to get in and combat these things and deal with these things on that playing field. If your passion or your thing is housing, is cooking, is sports, you can find a point of entry and an avenue in any of those arenas. And you should. And you can do those things while also continuing to learn and educate yourself. But you don't need to do all of those things before you make that initial move.
Yeah, I think that's no, man, that's a great point. Activate your community, activate your tribe, right? Like, organize within the spaces you're in, organize your, you know, your shul, your reboot group, organize your reading club, organize the block you're on. You know what I mean? I think you're right, man. That's a good note to go out on. David, where you at, fam?
All right. Hey, Adam and Kevin, thank you so much for that amazing conversation. It's really great just to hear two friends who have thought so deeply about a subject matter kind of take it on and go deep. And I really, really appreciate it. I think we could have listened to you for another hour. And I think the amount of questions in the question and answer list just shows you how much continued interest there is in what you're talking about. And, you know, it's like questions lead to questions lead to questions. And I appreciate you guys coming to answer some of those questions today. So thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just here to say goodbye. We're past our time. If you want to know more about future conversations, go to rebooters.net. Follow us on Twitter. And again, Kevin and Adam, thank you very, very much. That was incredible. Thank you.